In the humid, suffocating summer of 1839, in Madison County, Mississippi, a story unfolded so dark that it was intentionally erased from the official records of America. It is the tale of Hiram Calloway, a wealthy and powerful master who announced a forbidden marriage to his own slave, a young woman named Eliza. This shocking union was not the true horror. The real nightmare began months later with the discovery of a hidden document buried in an old accounting ledger, a single piece of paper that revealed a secret so monstrous it proved the beautiful young woman he had taken as his wife was, in fact, his own daughter. This is the story of that discovery, of a family built on a catastrophic sin and of a disappearance into a swamp that even the authorities refuse to investigate, leaving a mystery that haunts the land to this day. How did a man of such power and control come to be consumed by a truth he himself had created and forgotten? And what really happened on that final, desperate night when Hiram Calloway walked into the swamp to settle a debt with the ghosts of his past? The answers lie not in the history that was written, but in the evidence that was burned, the whispers that survived, and the land that never forgets. Before we delve into the decaying archives of the Calloway family, we invite you to become part of our community of historical investigators. If you believe that the most important stories are the ones that have been deliberately hidden, subscribe to Before the Story and enable all notifications so you never miss an excavation into the past. Please like this video if you value these deep dives into our most unsettling histories. And let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The Calloway case begins not in the mud of the Mississippi Delta, but in the sterile silence of an archive, within a brittle leather box unearthed in 1958. Its contents, a handful of letters and a single water-damaged journal, the last remnants of Hiram Calloway's meticulously ordered world. The earliest letters, dated from 1835, are penned in a script as rigid and controlled as the man himself. They speak of cotton prices, land acquisitions, and the precise accounting of human lives, each name entered into a ledger with the same dispassion as bushels of corn or heads of cattle. These documents paint a portrait of a man who believed in the absolute power of his own will, a master convinced that every aspect of his domain could be managed, measured, and contained. His plantation, known as Providence, stretched across 800 acres of rich black soil, wrested from the Yazoo River floodplains. It was a kingdom built on discipline and profit, ruled by a man who had been a widower for nearly 2 decades. Hiram Calloway's obsession was not with comfort, but with legacy, a name and a fortune that would outlast him, carved into the very landscape of Madison County. He saw the world as a series of accounts to be balanced, of assets to be managed. The enslaved people who worked his fields were entries in this grand ledger, their humanity a factor too intangible to be considered in his cold, relentless arithmetic of power. The land itself seemed to reflect his temperament. Orderly rows of cotton stretched to the horizon, a testament to his control. But at the edge of his cultivated empire lay the Black Cypress Swamp, a vast, chaotic territory of dark water and tangled growth that defied any attempt at cultivation. It was a place of myth and fear, a border between his world of rigid order and a natural world of profound, untamable mystery. The swamp was a constant, silent presence, its humid breath settling over the fields at dusk, a reminder that not everything could be fenced in and accounted for. This stark contrast between the managed fields and the wild swamp would become the stage for his undoing. Hiram's letters reveal a profound isolation, the self-imposed solitude of a man who trusted no one but himself. He had no close friends, and his correspondence with family was limited to curt, financial matters. His world was the plantation, and his society was composed of those who were his property. This detachment from the world of his peers, this belief in his own exceptionalism, is what allowed him to believe he could operate outside the unwritten laws of his society. He was a man who saw rules as things that applied to lesser men, not to the architect of his own destiny, the absolute monarch of providence. This carefully constructed reality, however, was built on a fragile foundation of willed ignorance. The letters, for all their detail on profit and loss, are marked by what they omit. There is no mention of emotion, no hint of introspection, no acknowledgement of the complex human lives that sustained his wealth. His journal was not a place for reflection, but another kind of ledger, one that tracked his ambitions and his assets. He documented his world not to understand it, but to possess it, to ensure that every piece of it was accounted for under his name. But history is a debt that always comes due, and some accounts cannot be settled with coin. The silence in his records was a void waiting to be filled, a space where the unwritten truths of his life festered. The box of letters, discovered over a century later, represents the first attempt to reconstruct a story that Hiram Callaway did everything in his power to destroy. It is the beginning of an investigation into a man who built an empire of order, only to be consumed by the chaos he had buried at its very foundation, a chaos that would rise from the silence of his own ledgers. What the early records show is a man at the peak of his power, utterly confident in his control over his world. He believed his wealth and his will were impenetrable fortresses, capable of shielding him from any consequence. He could not have known that the greatest threat to his kingdom was not a market crash or a failed crop, but a single, forgotten entry in a dusty book, a ghost from his past, preserved in his own handwriting. The stage was set for a tragedy not of fate, but of history, a story of a man who would be undone by his own meticulous record-keeping. The atmosphere at Providence in the years leading up to 1839 was one of oppressive, suffocating quiet. It was the quiet of absolute authority, where dissent was not tolerated and emotion was a liability. Hiram moved through his domain like a spectre, his presence felt in every corner of the plantation, from the main house to the furthest fields. It was a world held in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a catalyst, for a single event that would shatter the fragile peace and expose the rot beneath the carefully polished surface. That catalyst would not be an act of rebellion, but an act of what Hiram Callaway, in his profound delusion, called love. The final piece of this prelude is a sense of impending doom that permeates even the most mundane of his writings. Reading his letters with the knowledge of what is to come, one can feel the tension building beneath the surface of his controlled prose. Every mention of legacy feels like a tragic irony, every declaration of his own power a prelude to his fall. His world was a house of cards, built with immense precision and care, but a single breath of truth was all that would be required to bring the entire structure crashing down around him. The story of Hiram Callaway is the story of that breath. The first tremor to shake the foundations of Hiram Callaway's world is recorded in a letter dated May 4th, 1839. It arrived from his lawyer and distant cousin in Jackson, a man named Elias Vance, whose family had managed the Callaways' legal affairs for 2 generations. The letter's tone is a delicate dance of deference and alarm, the prose of a man delivering a warning he knows will be unwelcome. He had received Hiram's instructions regarding the manumission and subsequent marriage to the enslaved girl, Eliza, and felt compelled by familial duty to advise against it. The document is a masterpiece of cautious legal phrasing, a document that speaks of the potential social and financial ramifications of such an unprecedented union. Vance's letter avoids any moral judgment, focusing instead on the practicalities of a world built on a rigid racial hierarchy. "Hiram," the letter reads, "while your right to dispose of your property as you see fit is of course legally unassailable, this course of action is unconventional. Such a public elevation of one of your own servants, regardless of her personal merits, will undoubtedly provoke commentary. Your standing in the county, so carefully cultivated, may be compromised by those who do not understand the affections that motivate you." The lawyer's carefully chosen words reveal the depth of the transgression Hiram was contemplating. It was a violation not just of law, but of the fundamental order of their society. Hiram's reply, a draft of which was found preserved among his papers, is a monument to his arrogance. The script is forceful, the words sharp and dismissive, betraying no hint of doubt. He scoffs at the notion that his standing could be threatened by the opinions of what he calls lesser men, whose fortunes are as thin as their convictions. He describes Eliza not as a person with a will of her own, but as an object of his discernment, praising her quiet grace and serene temperament, qualities he claims have been absent from this house for too long. He frames his decision not as a radical social act, but as a simple matter of personal preference, the prerogative of a man accountable to no one. The exchange is a critical piece of evidence, a documented moment where Hiram formally declares his intention to break with the norms of his world. He sees his marriage to Eliza as the ultimate expression of his power, the ability to remake reality according to his own desires, to elevate a piece of property to the status of a wife simply by declaring it so. He failed to understand that society's rules, while unwritten, were enforced by a consensus more powerful than any single man's wealth. His act was not seen as one of love, but as one of madness, a dangerous crack in the edifice of white supremacy. This decision marks the first documented anomaly in the otherwise predictable pattern of Hiram's life. For years, he had operated as a shrewd and respected, if feared, member of the planter class. He had played by the rules of his world, using them to amass wealth and influence. Now, at the age of 55, he was choosing to detonate those rules, driven by an impulse that even his closest associate could not comprehend. The lawyer's letter is a plea for him to reconsider, to think of his legacy, the very thing Hiram had spent his life building. But Hiram's response shows that his concept of legacy had shifted. He was no longer content to be merely wealthy. He wanted to be singular, a man whose will could bend the world to its shape. The marriage was to be his masterpiece, a demonstration of his absolute freedom from the constraints of convention. He believed his fortune was a shield, that the disapproval of his neighbors would be nothing more than the buzzing of flies, easily swatted away. He was fatally mistaken. The scandal would not be a fleeting storm, but a slow-acting poison that would seep into every corner of his life. The letter exchange is the point of no return. Once the letters were sent, the decision was made, and the consequences were set in motion. Hiram was not just announcing a marriage, he was declaring war on the social order that had made him. He was trading the respect of his peers for the companionship of a 19-year-old girl who was, by the laws of both God and man in his world, his property. The documents show that he did so with his eyes wide open, fully aware of the scandal he would cause, but utterly convinced of his own immunity. This act of defiance, so clearly recorded, is the key that unlocks the rest of the tragedy. Without understanding the depth of his arrogance, his belief in his own untouchability, his subsequent unraveling is incomprehensible. He was a man who believed he could control the narrative, that he could define the terms of his own existence. He would soon discover that some truths cannot be controlled, and that the past, once written into the record, can never be truly erased. His decision to marry Eliza was the beginning of his collision with that unforgiving reality. The final paragraph of his letter to Vance is perhaps the most telling. "The matter is settled," he writes, the words underlined twice. "Providence will have a mistress, and I will have a companion. Let the county whisper. Their gossip is the price of my contentment, and it is a price I am more than willing to pay." And it is the statement of a man who believes he has just won a great victory, a man who has no idea that he has just signed his own death warrant, not with a pistol or a blade, but with a simple declaration of love that was, in fact, the most profound act of self-destruction. The whispers Hiram so arrogantly dismissed began almost immediately, and the evidence of his growing isolation is meticulously recorded in the diary of a neighboring planter, Lucius Thorne. Thorne, a man of lesser wealth but older lineage, chronicled the Callaway affair with a mixture of morbid fascination and sanctimonious disapproval. An entry from June 1839 reads, "Callaway has done the unthinkable. He has taken the Negro girl Eliza as his wife in a private ceremony at his own home. He has made a mockery of the sacrament and of his own station. The doors of decent society are now, and must remain, closed to him." This document provides a clear view of the social consequences Hiram faced. He had become a pariah overnight. Thorne's diary continues to track Hiram's descent into self-imposed exile. He notes that Callaway no longer attends the local church, a significant social and spiritual hub for the planter class. Invitations to dinners and social gatherings, once a regular part of his life, now go unanswered. "He has built a wall of silence around Providence," Thorne writes. "One sees his carriage on the road to Jackson, but he speaks to no one. It is as if he means to create a separate kingdom, a perverse Eden with his dusky Eve." The diary serves as a record of the community's judgment, a social quarantine enacted to contain the contagion of his transgression. But the most chilling piece of evidence from this period is not an outsider's account, but a cold, bureaucratic artifact from within the Callaway plantation itself. It is the household ledger for the year 1839, a massive, leather-bound volume where every expense, every transaction, every piece of property was recorded. In the inventory of enslaved persons under the list for July, the name Eliza 19 Mulatto, skilled in domestic service, is neatly crossed out with a single, firm line of ink. Beside it, in Hiram's unmistakable, elegant hand, a new entry has been made: Mrs. Eliza Callaway. This simple clerical act is a microcosm of the entire tragedy. It is an attempt to alter reality through sheer force of will, to transform a human being from one category of existence to another with the stroke of a pen. The crossed-out name and the new title, existing side by side on the same page, represent the impossible contradiction at the heart of Hiram's new life. Eliza was both property and wife, a legal and social paradox that could not be reconciled. The ledger, a book of objective facts, had become the site of his most profound delusion, a document bearing witness to an irreconcilable truth. The visual impact of this document is immense. It is a physical manifestation of his attempt to rewrite the rules of his world. For Hiram, this act was likely one of liberation, of formalizing his decision. But to an outside observer, it is an act of profound violence, an erasure of one identity and the imposition of another, all recorded with the cold detachment of a bookkeeper. It demonstrates his belief that he could simply amend the record, that his own handwriting had the power to override the fundamental truths of his society. He was treating a human life and a sacred institution with the same administrative authority he used for his cotton sales. This ledger entry becomes a symbol of his fatal flaw. He believed that power resided in ownership and documentation, that if he wrote something down, it became true. He failed to see that truth has its own existence, independent of any ledger or title. By making this entry, he was not creating a new reality, he was simply creating a more detailed record of his own folly, a piece of evidence that would later be used to chart his descent into madness. The page is a testament to his attempt to control a narrative that was already spiraling far beyond his reach. Furthermore, the ledger entry would have been seen by others within his household, an overseer perhaps, or an accountant. It was not a private act. It was a public declaration within the closed world of his plantation, a signal to everyone that the old rules no longer applied. This would have created an atmosphere of deep uncertainty and fear. The enslaved community would have seen it as a sign of the master's instability, a dangerous and unpredictable shift in the foundations of their world. The white staff would have seen it as a deep source of shame and a threat to their own standing. The accumulation of this evidence, the diary of a scornful neighbor, the self-imposed isolation, the bizarre and contradictory ledger entry, paints a picture of a man deliberately severing his ties to the world, retreating into a private reality of his own making. He was fortifying his plantation not against physical intruders, but against the judgment of his peers. He was creating an island, a sovereign nation of two, where the only law was his own desire. But islands are prisons as much as they are sanctuaries, and Hiram was unknowingly becoming a prisoner of the very freedom he sought to express. These documents, when viewed together, show the first stage of his unraveling. The initial act of defiance was followed by a doubling down, a stubborn refusal to acknowledge the consequences. He was not merely ignoring the whispers, he was actively creating a new set of records to codify his new reality. He believed that if he controlled the documents, he controlled the truth. It would take another document, one he had long forgotten, to teach him that the past is not so easily amended, and that some truths once recorded have the power to destroy everything. The catalyst for the final catastrophic phase of the Calloway affair arrived in the form of a man named Alistair Davies, a young, ambitious accountant hired by Hiram in the autumn of 1839 to conduct a full audit of the plantation's finances. Davies was a man of numbers, a meticulous professional from New Orleans who cared little for the social scandals of rural Mississippi. His sole focus was on the columns of assets and debts, the clean and verifiable world of accounting. It was this professional detachment that made him the unwilling instrument of Hiram's destruction, for he saw not a family's history, but a series of records that failed to align. His discovery is detailed in a letter to Hiram, dated October 12, 1839. The letter, preserved by chance among unrelated tax documents, is a model of professional decorum, its calm tone making the revelation it contains all the more devastating. Davies explains that in the process of reconciling the ledgers from the estate of Hiram's late father, he uncovered a minor but persistent discrepancy in the accounting of human property from 2 decades prior. To resolve it, he had to consult the older, semi-retired books, volumes that had not been opened in years. It was there, tucked between a receipt for cottonseed and a bill of sale for a horse, that he found it. "Sir," the letter begins, betraying nothing of the shock that must have accompanied its writing, "I write to you to clarify a matter of some delicacy. In reconciling the ledgers from your late father's estate, I discovered a document that appears to have been misfiled, a birth record from the year 1820. It is for a female child, Eliza, born in March of that year to the woman, Sarah. While the mother's name is not unusual, the document is irregular in one particular. In the column reserved for the father, a space almost always left blank in such cases, a name has been entered. The name, sir, is your own." This paragraph is the bombshell. It is the first hypothesis, the first documented suggestion of the horrific truth, formulated not from gossip or suspicion, but from the cold, hard evidence of a forgotten record. Davies, the accountant, had no reason to lie or to invent such a story. He was merely reporting a finding, an anomalous piece of data that disrupted the clean lines of his audit. He had stumbled upon the foundational secret of the Callaway plantation, a 19-year-old sin preserved in the dry, bureaucratic language of a birth certificate. The letter is the objective, external confirmation of a truth Hiram had either forgotten or willfully suppressed. The document itself is described in the letter. It was not a formal state certificate, but a simple plantation record, a single page in a book used to track the increase of his human property. Such records were common, a grim necessity for the business of slavery. But the inclusion of the father's name was a wild anomaly. It was a detail that served no practical purpose, an unnecessary and dangerous piece of information. Why Hiram would have recorded it is a question that can never be answered. Perhaps it was a fleeting moment of sentiment, of pride, or of a strange proprietary impulse to claim his issue, even as he condemned it to a life of bondage. Hiram's reaction to the letter is the final, damning piece of evidence in this stage of the story. The accountant, perhaps fearing the sensitivity of the information, had sent the letter by a trusted courier. Hiram's reply, a frantic handwritten note scribbled on the back of Davy's own letter, was found with it. The elegant, controlled script of his earlier correspondence is gone, replaced by a jagged, barely legible scrawl that speaks of pure panic. The words are a command, not a request, stripped of all courtesy. "You will bring the ledger to me at once. Speak of this to no one. Your silence will be rewarded." The tone of this note is a confession in itself. It is not the response of a man confronted with a falsehood or a mistake. It is the response of a man whose darkest secret has just been unearthed. His immediate impulse is not to question the finding, but to seize and destroy the evidence. His offer of a reward for silence is a clear admission of guilt. In that moment, the careful facade of the powerful, untouchable master crumbled, revealing the terrified, guilty man beneath. The accountant had not just balanced a book. He had passed a final, irrevocable judgment. This exchange marks the turning point of the narrative. The mystery is no longer about a scandalous marriage. It is now about a far darker, more elemental sin. The conflict shifts from an external one, with Hiram against society, to an internal one, with Hiram against his own past. The ledger, once a symbol of his power and control, had become his accuser. The accountant, a neutral observer, had become the witness to his crime. The first hypothesis had been formulated, and it was so monstrous that it threatened to annihilate not just Hiram's reputation, but his very sanity. The silence that followed this exchange was profound. The records show that Alistair Davies left Madison County 2 days later, his contract terminated, a generous sum paid for his discretion. He was never heard from in Mississippi again. Hiram was now alone with his discovery, with the physical proof of his sin. The ledger was in his hands. He now had to confront the reality that the woman he had made his wife, the centerpiece of his defiant new world, was the living embodiment of a past he had tried and failed to bury. The whispering of his neighbors was about to be replaced by the screaming of his own conscience. After the accountant's departure, a new kind of silence descended upon Providence, a heavy, knowing quiet that was more terrifying than any open condemnation. The truth, once unearthed, did not remain confined to the main house. It spread through the enslaved community not as a rumor, but as a confirmation of a long-held suspicion. The evidence for this comes from a source far removed from Hiram's world. The transcript of a Works Progress Administration interview conducted in 1936 with an elderly woman named Martha, who'd been born a slave on the Callaway plantation. Her testimony, recorded nearly a century after the events, provides the missing piece of the puzzle, the perspective of the enslaved. Martha's voice, filtered through the notes of the interviewer, describes the change that came over the plantation as a whispering sickness. She explains that one of the field hands, a man named Samuel, who sometimes assisted in the office, had seen the birth record in the old ledger before Hiram could destroy it. He understood its meaning instantly. Samuel? He couldn't read the writing, Martha recalled, but he knew the names. He saw Master Hiram's name and Sarah's name and the child's name all on one paper. He didn't have to read to know what that meant. He told his wife, and she told me. In a day, we all knew. We knew Miss Eliza was his blood. This revelation did not cause shock among the enslaved community, but a profound, sorrowful resignation. The violation of enslaved women by their masters was a common, brutal reality of their lives. The horror of Hiram's story was not the initial act, but the grotesque irony of the marriage. The fact that his sin had circled back to him in a way that could not be ignored. Martha's testimony reveals that the enslaved people became silent observers of his unraveling, their knowledge a form of passive power. We didn't say nothing to him, she stated, but he knew we knew. You could see it in his eyes when he passed us. He was looking to see if we was looking at him, and we was. The social fracture was complete. Hiram was now isolated not just from his white peers, but from the very people who were his property. He was living in a house on a plantation where every single person, from the woman he shared his bed with to the man who tilled his furthest field, knew his most shameful secret. This created an atmosphere of unbearable psychological tension. His authority, which depended on an illusion of moral and racial superiority, had been irrevocably shattered. He was no longer the master in complete control. He was a guilty man, exposed and judged by the silent eyes of his captives. The most profound impact was on Eliza herself. Martha's testimony provides the only surviving account of her reaction. She knew too, Martha said, not from words. Nobody ever told her, but a truth that big, it got a weight to it. You can feel it in the air. She just stopped smiling. The light went out of her eyes. Master Hiram would talk to her, and she would sit there at his big table in her fine dress, and she would look right through him, like he wasn't even there. This description paints a heartbreaking portrait of a young woman trapped in a nightmare, forced to live out the consequences of a sin that was not her own. Eliza's silent emotional withdrawal was a form of resistance more powerful than any rebellion. It was a rejection of the entire false reality Hiram had constructed. He had married her to possess her grace and serenity, and now that was the very thing his own history had destroyed. He had sought companionship and instead found a living embodiment of his guilt, a constant silent accuser sitting across from him at his own dinner table. Her physical presence was a constant reminder of his transgression, and her emotional absence was his punishment. This period, as described by Martha, was the true beginning of Hiram's descent. The judgment of his white neighbors was a matter of social standing, something his arrogance could dismiss. But the silent, knowing judgment of the enslaved community and of Eliza herself was a moral indictment he could not escape. It was a judgment passed not in a courtroom, but in the averted gazes, the sudden silences, the atmosphere of sorrow that now permeated his home. He had become the sole prisoner in a jail of his own making. The social fracture was not a loud, violent break, but a quiet, cellular disintegration of the plantation's social fabric. The established roles of master and slave, husband and wife, had become meaningless, replaced by the more elemental roles of perpetrator and victim, guilty and innocent. The power dynamic had been inverted. Hiram still held the legal power of life and death, but the moral authority had shifted entirely to those he enslaved. They were the keepers of the truth, and their shared, unspoken knowledge was a weapon against which he had no defense. The whispering sickness was the final stage before the fever broke. The tension had reached an unsustainable level. The silence was pregnant with an impending catastrophe. Hiram was a man living on a precipice, haunted by the living and the dead, trapped in a house where every face reflected his own guilt. The fracture was complete, the foundation of his world had given way, and all that was left was the final, inevitable collapse. Martha's testimony makes it clear that everyone on the plantation was simply waiting for it to happen. The physical proof of Hiram Calloway's sin, the document that underpinned the entire horrific truth, was not entirely destroyed. In his panic, Hiram had burned the old ledger, attempting to erase the past with fire. But a single charred fragment of the birth certificate survived, preserved by an act of historical providence. It was discovered in 1972, not in an archive, but pressed between the pages of a Calloway family Bible that had been sold at an estate auction decades earlier. Why it was saved, or by whom, remains a mystery. Perhaps it was kept by a guilt-ridden family member, a tangible piece of a secret they could neither discard nor confess. The fragment itself is a powerful artifact. A photograph of it reveals a small, browned piece of paper, its edges scorched, the ink faded by time. Most of the words are lost, turned to ash, but two phrases remain perfectly, chillingly legible, written in the same elegant, controlled script as Hiram's early business letters. The first is a date, March 1820. The second is a simple declaration under a printed column, heading, Father H. Calloway. This fragment is the irrefutable evidence, the material confirmation of the whispers and the accountant's letter. It is the objective, physical truth that survived the flames. The impact of this truth on Hiram is documented with harrowing clarity in the few remaining entries of his personal journal. These entries, written in the days following his burning of the ledger, are a stark contrast to his earlier confident writings. They are the ravings of a mind coming undone, a record of his psychological disintegration. An entry dated October 18, 1839, reveals the depth of his torment. He was now haunted not just by the truth, but by the ghost of the woman he had wronged 19 years prior. I see her face in Eliza's, he wrote. I see Sarah's eyes looking at me from my wife's chair. The house has become a hall of mirrors, and every reflection is an accusation. His world, once a kingdom of his own making, had transformed into a prison of his own conscience. The physical spaces of his home were no longer sources of comfort or pride, but stages for his psychological torture. Eliza, the woman he had married for her serene presence, had become a spectre, a living conduit for the ghost of her mother. His journal entry reveals his complete inability to separate the two women in his mind. He was trapped in a temporal loop, the sin of the past playing out in the present, every moment a fresh confrontation with his guilt. The document and the diary entry, when placed side by side, create a devastating portrait of crime and punishment. The fragment is the cold, hard fact of his paternity. The diary entry is the emotional and spiritual consequence of that fact. He had tried to destroy the physical evidence, but he could not destroy the truth that now lived inside his own mind. The fire had consumed the paper, but it had only fueled the flames of his internal hell. His guilt was not just a memory, it was an active, malevolent presence in his life. This documented impact shows a man being consumed from the inside out. His authority, his wealth, his social standing, none of it could protect him from the relentless assault of his own memory. The journal entries become increasingly fragmented, his handwriting devolving further. He writes of sleepless nights, of a constant, low, humming sound that seems to emanate from the walls of the house. A sound no one else can hear. He was experiencing a complete psychotic break, his mind collapsing under the weight of a truth it could no longer suppress. The fragment of the birth certificate serves as the anchor for this part of the story. Without it, his madness could be dismissed as the product of a troubled mind, but the fragment proves that his visions were not delusions. They were a rational, if extreme, response to a horrific reality. He was not going mad, he was becoming sane, finally forced to see the world as it truly was, stripped of the lies and rationalizations he had used to protect himself for 2 decades. The horror was not in his mind, it was in his history. The combination of these 2 pieces of evidence, the material and the psychological, marks the point of no return for Hiram. He has confronted the truth, he has failed to destroy it, and it is now actively destroying him. His carefully constructed world has been reduced to a single, tormenting reality. He is married to his own child, the daughter of a woman whose memory now haunts him relentlessly. The social fracture was the prelude. This is the main event, the complete and total collapse of his identity. The final entry from this period is a single, desperate line scrawled at the bottom of a page. "The silence is an answer," he wrote. He understood now that the quiet judgment of his slaves, the emotional void from his wife, the humming in the walls, it was all a form of sentence being passed. He was no longer the master of Providence. He was its most tormented spirit, a ghost in his own house, waiting for the final act of a tragedy he had authored himself. The irrefutable evidence had not set him free. It had locked him in a cage with his own soul. In the final weeks of his life, Hiram Calloway's authority, the very core of his identity, disintegrated completely. His personal journal, the last remaining record of his internal state, charts this collapse with terrifying precision. The entries become shorter, more sporadic, the jottings of a man losing his grip on language and reality. The once powerful planter, the master of hundreds of acres and dozens of lives, was reduced to a paranoid recluse, a prisoner in the house he had built as a monument to his own power. His commands were no longer obeyed with crisp efficiency, but with a slow, deliberate reluctance that was a form of insubordination in itself. An entry from October 25th captures his growing paranoia and his awareness of the silent judgment surrounding him. "The silence from the quarters is louder than a drum," he wrote. "They watch me when I pass. They do not lower their eyes. They know. Their silence is their judgment, a verdict delivered in 1,000 daily glances." He understood that his power had always been a performance, a shared belief in his superiority. Now that the belief was shattered, his authority was a hollow shell. He was a king whose subjects no longer recognized his divine right to rule, and their quiet defiance was a constant, unnerving reminder of his fall. His psychological torment began to manifest as auditory hallucinations, a classic symptom of a mind under extreme duress. He became fixated on a sound he believed was coming from the direction of the Black Cypress Swamp. November 1st, the journal reads, "Sleepless. I hear humming on the wind from the swamp. It is the song Sarah used to sing while she mended the cotton sacks, a song I have not heard in 19 years. It is a summons." This entry marks a critical shift. His guilt was no longer just a memory. It had taken on a physical presence, a voice calling to him from the place of his first great transgression. The swamp, once a passive boundary to his kingdom, was becoming an active character in his personal drama. It was the repository of his darkest secrets, and now those secrets were calling back to him. The song of a dead woman carried on the wind was a manifestation of a justice that operated outside the laws of man. It was the sound of a past that refused to stay buried. His authority over the cultivated fields of his plantation was meaningless in the face of the wild, retributive power he felt emanating from the swamp. The natural world itself seemed to be passing judgment on him. His sense of self began to erode. He no longer recognized the man he had been. A particularly disturbing entry from November 5th reads, "I saw my father's face in the mirror today, but his eyes were mine. He looked at me with a contempt I remember from my youth. He knew what I was. He always knew." Hiram was now haunted by 3 generations of Calloways. His father, the man whose legacy he had tried to uphold, himself, the perpetrator of the sin, and his daughter, the living evidence of it. His entire lineage felt corrupted, his identity fractured beyond repair. The functional authority of the plantation also collapsed. Overseers' reports from that November, though they do not mention the master's mental state, hint at a breakdown in discipline. They note a decrease in productivity, an increase in sullenness among the field hands. The finely tuned machine of Providence was grinding to a halt because its central gear had broken. Hiram no longer had the mental capacity or the moral authority to command the respect and fear necessary to run such an enterprise. His kingdom was rotting from the head down. This collapse was not just psychological and social, it was existential. Hiram had built his life on a foundation of control, the belief that he was the master of his fate. The revelation of his paternity and the subsequent haunting shattered this belief. He was forced to confront the fact that he was not in control, that his actions had consequences that spiraled far beyond his ability to manage. He was a character in a story whose ending was already written, a tragic figure moving inexorably toward a doom he had set in motion 2 decades earlier. The journal entries show a man actively surrendering to the forces he perceives are closing in on him. He stops fighting the hallucinations and begins to interpret them as messages. The humming is no longer just a sound, it is a summons. He is beginning to accept his fate, to see a path forward that is not one of redemption, but of atonement. The collapse of his external authority was necessary for him to finally confront his internal truth. He had to lose control of his world to finally understand his place in it. The final evidence of his collapsed authority is the state of the journal itself. The last few pages are filled with aimless doodles, repeated words, and ink blots, as if he could no longer form coherent thoughts. It is the record of a mind imploding. The man who had once managed a vast and complex enterprise with cold precision could no longer manage his own sentences. His authority over language, the last bastion of his control, was gone. All that was left was the raw, terrifying noise of his own guilt, a sound that was pulling him, step by step, toward the swamp. The narrative of Hiram Calloway's final days, as pieced together from his journal, is one of a man haunted by the ghost of his past. But his journal tells only half the story. The other half, the hidden truth that recontextualizes his entire collapse, comes once again from the WPA testimony of Martha. Decades after the fact, the interviewer, seeking to understand the local law surrounding the Calloway plantation, asked a simple question that unlocked the heart of the mystery. What truly happened to Eliza's mother, Sarah, all those years ago? The answer reveals a secret the enslaved community had kept for 19 years. Martha's recorded response is delivered with a calm, solemn gravity. Master Hiram, he told everyone Sarah died of swamp fever a month after Eliza was born. That was his story, the one in his books. He gave her a Christian burial in the slave cemetery, put a wooden cross on her grave. He made a big show of it, but that grave is empty. We all knew it was empty. This statement is the first bombshell, a direct contradiction of the official record, an assertion that Hiram's grief was a performance and her death a lie. The interviewer, presumably intrigued, pressed for more details. What followed was the revelation of a story of quiet, desperate resistance. Sarah had not died of a fever. According to Martha, a week after Eliza was born, after the physical trauma of the birth had subsided, Sarah had made a choice. She had been a proud woman, one who had endured her violation with a stoic silence, but the birth of her child, a child who was the physical embodiment of her master's power over her, was a reality she could not live with. It was a chain that bound her to him forever. She waited till a night with no moon, Martha's testimony continues. She wrapped Eliza up warm and gave her to me. She said, "You raise her up, you keep her safe." Then she turned and walked away from the cabins, not toward the big house but toward the swamp. She walked right into the black cypress swamp and never walked out. She gave her body to the water and the cypress roots rather than give another day of her life to that house. That was her justice, not his. This account transforms Sarah from a passive victim into an active agent of her own destiny, a woman who chose oblivion over continued bondage. This hidden source changes everything. Hiram's haunting was not the product of a guilty conscience dredging up a random memory. The humming he heard was not a generic ghost song. It was a specific call from a specific place, the very place where the woman he had wronged had made her final, defiant stand. He was not just being haunted by the memory of a woman who had died. He was being haunted by the truth of how she died, a truth he never even knew. The secret kept by the enslaved community had become a potent spiritual force. This revelation explains the power the swamp held over him. He felt a summons from the swamp because it was, in a very real sense, Sarah's final resting place. Her act of self-destruction had consecrated the land, turning it into a place of judgment. The enslaved community understood this. They knew the swamp held a special significance. Their silence on the matter was not just about protecting themselves. It was about protecting Sarah's secret, about honoring her final act. They allowed Hiram to believe his own lie about the fever, knowing that the real truth was a power they held in reserve. The discovery of this hidden source deepens the story's moral complexity. It suggests a form of justice that operates on a spiritual plane, a web of knowledge and memory maintained by the oppressed. Hiram's world of ledgers and legal documents was a fiction. The true history of the plantation was preserved in the oral tradition of the enslaved, a history of pain and resistance that was invisible to the master. He was living in a world whose most important truths were completely unknown to him. This also reframes the final act of the story. Hiram's walk into the swamp was not just a flight from his own guilt, it was an unknowing pilgrimage to the site of Sarah's self-liberation. He was being drawn to the source of the story, to the place where the consequences of his actions had reached their first tragic conclusion. The humming was not just in his mind, it was the echo of a real event, a spiritual resonance left in the landscape, a story the land itself had absorbed. Martha's testimony is the key that makes the supernatural elements of Hiram's collapse feel grounded and earned. It is the hidden source that reveals the true nature of the forces at play. The justice that was coming for Hiram Calloway was not just psychological, it was historical. A debt passed down from a woman who had chosen the swamp over him. He was about to be undone not by a ghost, but by a choice that had been waiting for him in the dark water for 19 years. The final coherent entry in Hiram Calloway's journal, dated November 10th, 1839, the night he disappeared, stands as his last will and testament. It is not a suicide note in the conventional sense. It is a document of chilling, almost serene resignation. The frantic, paranoid scrawl of the previous weeks is gone, replaced by a steady, deliberate hand, as if a great fever had finally broken. This entry is his justification for the action he is about to take, a final accounting of a debt he has come to understand he must pay in person. It is the confession of a man who has finally accepted his fate. The entry begins with a startling moment of clarity. The accountant's letter was not a revelation, he wrote. It was a summons. All these years I have balanced my ledgers, my profits and my losses. But one debt remains outstanding, an entry from a book I thought long closed. I have been a master of accounts, but a fool in the face of the truth. This opening is a complete repudiation of his former self. The man who believed he could control reality with his ledgers now admits that the most important ledger of all is the one kept by memory and consequence. He then addresses the hallucinations that have plagued him, but he no longer frames them as madness. He sees them now as communication, as a guide. The humming I hear is not a phantom of a troubled mind, his journal continues. It is a call to order. Sarah does not hum to haunt me, she hums to guide me. She sings the song of a debt that must be paid where it was incurred, in the place where the first entry was made. He has interpreted the ghostly song as a directive, a map leading him to the site of his original sin. The swamp is no longer a place of fear, but of necessity. This justification is crucial. It shows that Hiram is not simply fleeing from his unbearable reality. He is actively moving toward a resolution, albeit a grim one. He believes he is participating in a ritual of his own, a final, terrible act of balancing the books. His entire life has been about order and accounting, and in his broken mind, this is the only way to close the final gaping deficit in his moral ledger. He is applying the cold logic of his profession to the passionate chaos of his soul. The preparations he made, as later recounted by the house slaves, were as methodical as his journal entry. He did not flee in a panic. He dressed in a simple, dark suit, the kind he wore for business in Jackson. He did not take a horse or a lantern. He simply walked out of the main house, down the grand porch steps, and turned not toward the road, but toward the dark, tree-lined path that led to the Black Cypress Swamp. His actions were those of a man going to a prearranged appointment, a man who knows exactly where he is going and why. The source, his own journal, justifies this decisive action as an act of moral necessity. "A master is responsible for all that happens on his land," he wrote. "That is the law of our world. I am responsible for her and for the child. This is not an act of despair, but an act of ownership, the last I shall ever claim. I am going to correct what should never have happened." This final, chilling phrase is open to interpretation. Is he going to correct his sin by ending his own life? Or does he believe in his madness that he can somehow magically undo the past by returning to its source? The suspense in this section is built not through action, but through the cold, methodical detailing of his preparations and his chillingly rational justification for an irrational act. He is a man walking calmly toward his own destruction, convinced that it is the only logical course of action left to him. His decision feels less like a choice and more like the fulfillment of a prophecy, the final move in a game that was lost the moment he first laid hands on a young, enslaved woman named Sarah 19 years earlier. This journal entry is the last piece of communication from Hiram Calloway to the world. It is his attempt to frame his own end, to give it meaning. He casts himself not as a victim of madness, but as a man taking ultimate responsibility for his actions. It is a final, desperate attempt to reclaim a shred of the control he has lost, to be the author of his own end, even if that end is annihilation. The source presents a man who believes he's about to perform a final, solemn duty. The entry ends with a simple, haunting sentence. The ledger is now clear. For Hiram, his disappearance into the swamp was the final entry, the closing of an account, the balancing of a life that had become hopelessly, monstrously unbalanced. He walked into the darkness of the swamp to find a kind of peace, the terrible peace of a debt finally paid in full. His decisive action was not to live with his sin, but to be consumed by it, to merge with the landscape that held the memory of its origin. The story of what happened after Hiram Calloway walked towards the swamp is told through two final, starkly contrasting primary sources. The first is the institutional record, the official voice of law and order. It is the report filed by the Madison County Sheriff, a man named Jedediah Cole, in December of 1839, a month after Hiram's disappearance. The document is a dry, bureaucratic summary of a failed investigation, its language carefully chosen to close the case and quell any further inquiry. It represents society's attempt to impose a rational, non-threatening explanation on an event that defied easy categorization. Sheriff Cole's report states that a thorough search of the accessible parts of the Black Cypress Swamp was conducted by a party of 10 men. They found no tracks, no signs of a struggle, no body. The report makes special mention of Hiram's final journal entry, which it quotes in part. The note left by Mr. Calloway, the sheriff writes, clearly suggests a mind overcome by grief and delusion, likely brought on by the recent unfortunate death of his first wife. Given the contents of the note and the absence of any evidence of foul play, his disappearance is hereby ruled a probable suicide by drowning. The report is a masterclass in official erasure, reducing a complex tragedy to a simple case of madness and grief. The sheriff's interpretation is a deliberate fiction. He attributes Hiram's state of mind to the death of his first wife, who had been dead for nearly 20 years, completely ignoring the scandalous marriage to Eliza that was the true cause of his isolation. He dismisses the journal entry as the ramblings of a deluded mind, refusing to engage with its implications. The ruling of probable suicide is a convenient way to close a disturbing case, to restore a sense of order, and to avoid digging into the dark secrets of one of the county's most prominent families. It is the official story, designed to be final. But history is composed of more than official stories. Juxtaposed against the sheriff's report is the final, powerful interpretation offered by the WPA testimony of Martha. Her account is the voice of the community that witnessed the events, the voice of a different kind of knowledge. When the interviewer reads her the sheriff's conclusion, Martha's transcribed response is simple and unwavering. Her interpretation is not based on legal procedure, but on a deep, spiritual understanding of justice. It is the final primary source, the one that tells the truth the official record was designed to hide. The sheriff, he knew where to look, Martha stated, her voice imbued with the certainty of an eyewitness to a truth beyond the physical. But he didn't want to find him. It wasn't his place. Mr. Hiram didn't kill himself. Not in the way they mean. He was called. He was summoned. The swamp, it holds memories, it holds debts. Sarah gave herself to that water, and when the time came, the water came for him. The swamp takes what it's owed. That's a justice the law don't understand. This interpretation recasts the entire event. In Martha's telling, Hiram's death was not an act of self-destruction, but an act of supernatural retribution. The swamp is transformed from a passive location into an active agent of vengeance, a sentient force that balances the scales of justice. Hiram was not a suicide, he was a sacrifice, his life forfeit to the memory of the woman he had wronged. This is the spiritual climax of the story, a truth that exists in the realm of folklore, faith, and communal memory. The contrast between the two sources is absolute. The sheriff's report is a document of closure and denial, an attempt to bury a difficult story under the weight of officialdom. Martha's testimony is a document of memory and meaning, an insistence that the story not be forgotten, that its true spiritual significance be honored. One is a product of institutional power, designed to protect the status quo. The other is a product of communal wisdom, designed to preserve a truth that power would prefer to erase. The emotional impact of this final juxtaposition is immense. It forces the audience to choose which interpretation to believe. Is the truth found in the rational, logical, but clearly incomplete report of the sheriff, or is it found in the mythic, spiritual, but emotionally resonant account of the formerly enslaved woman? The story deliberately leaves this question open, suggesting that the most profound truths are often those that exist outside the boundaries of official documentation, in the stories people tell to make sense of the inexplicable. Ultimately, both sources agree on one thing: Hiram Calloway is gone, consumed by the swamp, but they offer two fundamentally different reasons for his demise. One is a story of individual madness, a private tragedy. The other is a story of cosmic justice, a communal epic. The final interpretation of the source material is left to the observer, but the weight of the narrative, the accumulation of evidence, all points toward the haunting truth in Martha's words. Hiram Calloway was not a victim of his own mind, but of a history that would not stay buried. The disappearance of Hiram Calloway did not end the story, it simply ended his role in it. The consequences of his actions rippled outward, documented not in personal journals, but in the cold, impersonal records of law and commerce. The first of these is a legal notice, published in the Jackson newspapers in the spring of 1840. It is an announcement of the public auction of the assets of the late Hiram Calloway's estate, to be held on the grounds of the Providence plantation. The document lists, in stark detail, the inventory to be sold: 800 acres of prime land, buildings, farm equipment, and at the bottom of the list, 47 healthy Negroes of various ages and skills. This notice represents the final, ignominious end of Hiram's obsession with legacy. The empire he had built, the name he had sought to immortalize, was dismantled and sold off to the highest bidder, its components scattered across the county. His carefully balanced ledgers were now in the hands of creditors. His land was divided, and the enslaved people he had owned, the silent witnesses to his downfall, were subjected to the final, brutal trauma of the auction block, their families torn apart as the financial consequences of their master's sin came due. The plantation, once a symbol of his power, was now just a collection of assets to be liquidated. The fate of Eliza, the woman at the center of this storm, is a thread that is harder to follow, a life that almost vanished from the historical record entirely. She was not listed among the enslaved people to be sold. Hiram's act of manumission before their marriage, it seems, was legally binding. For years her story was a blank, a ghost who disappeared from Mississippi after the auction. But a single remarkable document, discovered in the census records of Hamilton County, Ohio, provides a glimpse of her survival. The 1850 census lists an Eliza Calloway, 30, seamstress, born in Mississippi, living as a free woman in a small boarding house in Cincinnati. This census entry is a testament to her resilience. She had survived. She had escaped the South, escaped her past, and forged a new life for herself in the North. The record lists her as literate, suggesting she had learned to read and write, a skill that would have been forbidden to her at Providence. She had adopted her father's surname, a complex and perhaps painful choice, but one that may have provided a veneer of legitimacy in her new life. The document is a quiet, profound victory, proof that she had managed to build a life out of the ashes of the one that had been imposed upon her. Beyond this single entry, her trail goes cold. There are no letters, no diaries, no further records of her life. Her legacy is one of survival, not of testimony. She took her story with her, choosing, it seems, to live a life of quiet anonymity rather than bear witness to the horrors she had endured. We do not know if she ever remarried, if she had children, or if she found a measure of peace. All that is documented is that she lived, a free woman, a fact that is, in itself, a form of justice. Her disappearance from the record is a kind of freedom, an escape from a history that had almost destroyed her. The legacy of the land itself is more easily traced. The Providence plantation was purchased by a consortium of investors who divided it into smaller farms. The main house, the site of Hiram's psychological torment, was abandoned. No one wanted to live in a place so thoroughly soaked in tragedy and scandal. It fell into disrepair, its roof collapsing, its walls overrun with kudzu, a slow green erasure. Within a generation it was nothing more than a ruin, a cautionary tale told to local children, a physical manifestation of the Calloway family's collapse. The enslaved community of Providence was scattered to the winds. The names listed on the auction notice appear in the records of a dozen different plantations across Mississippi and Louisiana. The community that had shared the secret of Sarah's death, that had silently judged its master, was broken apart, its collective memory fragmented. Martha's WPA testimony is the only known account to have survived, a single voice speaking for the dozens who had witnessed the truth but whose stories were never recorded. Their legacy is one of silence and dispersal. The final document of this phase is a simple photograph of a grave in a historic Cincinnati cemetery. The headstone is small, weathered, the inscription barely legible. It reads, Eliza Calloway, 1820-1871. This is her final resting place. Her story ends not in the grand dramatic fashion of her father's, but in the quiet dignity of a life lived out to its natural conclusion. She had outlived him by more than 30 years. She had found a way to continue, to build a life on her own terms, far from the swamp that had claimed her father and the plantation that had been her prison. The consequences of Hiram Calloway's actions were absolute. His bloodline ended. His fortune was squandered. His name became synonymous with scandal and ruin. But from that wreckage, one person survived. Eliza's simple grave is the final, quiet counterpoint to Hiram's spectacular fall. He had sought a legacy of power and wealth and found only oblivion. She, who had been born with nothing, not even a name that was truly her own, managed to claim the one thing he had never possessed, a life of her own. Her survival is the story's final bittersweet grace note. The story of Hiram Calloway, as reconstructed from these fragmented sources, is more than just a forgotten family tragedy. It is a stark parable about the nature of truth and power in the Old South. Hiram believed that his power as a master gave him the right to define reality, to create and erase history through entries in a ledger. He operated under the delusion that his sins could be managed like any other asset, filed away and forgotten. His downfall serves as a powerful testament to the fact that history is not so easily controlled. The truth, once created, has a life of its own. The central irony of his story is that he was ultimately destroyed by the very system of record-keeping he used to build his empire. The birth certificate, a bureaucratic tool of ownership, became his death warrant. His journal, intended as a private record of his ambitions, became a public confession of his madness. His obsession with documentation, his need to write everything down, is what allowed this story to be pieced together over a century later. He was, in the end, the primary archivist of his own destruction, a man who left behind a perfect trail of evidence leading directly to the heart of his own guilt. The legacy of the land itself serves as a final, haunting postscript. The Calloway plantation was never rebuilt. For over 100 years, the land remained largely fallow, the ruins of the main house slowly sinking back into the earth. To this day, the area is known to locals in Madison County as Hiram's Folly, a name that has been passed down through generations, even by those who no longer know the specific details of the story. The name itself is a form of oral history, a preservation of the moral judgment passed on him by his community. The land holds the memory of his failure. The Black Cypress Swamp, the site of his final desperate pilgrimage, remains a place of local legend. It is seen as a place apart, a piece of land with a memory of its own. This brings us to a final curious piece of evidence, a recording made in 1962 by a folklorist from the Library of Congress who was collecting oral histories in the Mississippi Delta. He was interviewing an elderly man whose grandfather had been a slave on a plantation neighboring the Callaway property. The man was asked if he knew any local ghost stories. The recording captures the old man's voice, thick with the accent of the region, his tone utterly serious. "Nah," he says, "you don't go out to the old Callaway swamp after dark. Not never. My granddaddy, he said that place has a memory. He said if you listen real close on a quiet night, when the wind is just right, you can still hear a mother humming for her child, and for the man the water keeps." And this piece of folklore, recorded over 120 years after Hiram's disappearance, is the final echo of the story. It is the preservation of Martha's interpretation, the survival of the spiritual truth over the official record. The story has outlived the documents, transforming into a myth that is now embedded in the landscape itself. The humming that drove Hiram mad is still said to be there, a permanent feature of the place, a sound wave of justice that continues to ripple through time. The swamp has become a living monument to a crime that was never prosecuted, a grave for a man who was never buried. And so, the open question remains. What really happened to Hiram Callaway on that November night in 1839? Was his end a simple, tragic act of suicide, the desperate escape of a man cornered by his own guilt, as the official record states? Or was he answering a summons, pulled into the dark water by a force of retributive spiritual justice, a debt collected by the land itself? Was his final walk an act of madness, or was it the sanest, most necessary act of his life? The evidence is before you. The fragmented letters, the contradictory ledgers, the desperate journal, the eyewitness testimony, the official denials, and the persistent folklore. The truth, like Hiram Callaway himself, likely lies somewhere in the murky depths between the documented fact and the remembered story. It is a reminder that the most profound histories are not always found in archives, but are sometimes carried on the wind, in the warnings of old men, and in the low, mournful humming that rises from a swamp that refuses to forget. The official records are often designed to create silence, to bury the truths that are too uncomfortable to face. But the real stories, the ones that tell us who we truly are waiting in the archives, in the folklore, in the very soil beneath our feet. If you believe these truths need to be brought into the light, that these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, then join our mission. Subscribe to Before the Story, and become part of a community that understands that history is not what we are told, but what we have the courage to uncover. We'll see you in the next investigation.